The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to Gate City Chronicles. I'm Kevin Avard, your host, and today we have a special guest from the Nashua Telegraph, Mr. Dean Shalhoup. Welcome to the show. Glad that you're on.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome.
Dean, you've been with the Telegraph for a while now.
42 years, yes.
That's quite a while.
Quite some time, yes, yeah. Since high school.
Well, welcome to the show. You have an interesting story. Your father was a photographer.
Yes, he was. He preceded me at the Telegraph, and we overlapped for several years, and he became well known mostly in the 1950s and early part of the 60s for his photography. He also covered sports. He was a sports writer too, covered news on occasion, but mostly news and feature photography were his strengths.
Yeah. Now, he was basically an immigrant when he came to it.
He's actually a first-generation American. He and one of his sisters was born here, and the older two siblings were born in their home country of Lebanon.
Oh, wow.
Their parents had, their father came first to America, and then the mother followed them with the two little kids, and my father and another aunt were born here in America in Sanford, Maine.
Right. Interesting. And you were born in the 50s as well. Your father came here to Nashua around, what, 52?
52. He got a job at the Telegraph, and 2 years later I was born, and 3 years after that my sister was born.
Did you ask him the story why he got into photography, or why he got into, how did he, what drew him to the Telegraph?
Well, what drew him to photography is nothing specific, except that I know growing up, let's say in his junior high school and high school years, he was in various camera clubs, and for some reason he took a liking to photography. I found some old photos that show him and some other people in these group shots taken at camera club outings or what have you, and so forth, and some of the old photos are in boxes that he shot, excuse me, for these assignments or the contests they had. During high school, I believe his senior year in high school, he did some part-time work for the weekly newspaper in Sanford, Maine, called the Sanford Tribune at the time. And then when he graduated from high school, he worked there full-time for a year, and then joined the Army in 1939, I believe. He did a lot of photography. He was in Patton's Third Army, was in Germany most of the time, and did a lot of photography over there. Unfortunately, a lot of his equipment was stolen at some point, and along with it some photos, but to this day I retain some very historic photos that he took over there, including some of when he and other troops liberated concentration camps.
Wow.
And it was pretty powerful to see these images
Have they been published at all at any point?
There's been a couple that I ran with a column once I did about that kind of thing, and there's one that I can't put my hands on that I know I have that's one of my favorites. It shows him and 3 or 4 other guys sitting around a table. They got a sword through a Nazi flag, and they're holding up a bottle of wine or something. And he once told me, yeah, it's after we took over these camps. So obviously it was some Nazi officer's office, I guess, and they, were celebrating yet another camp being liberated. Most of his where he was Buchenwald.
Buchenwald. Did he go into details? I mean, was he must have been horrified when he saw what he saw.
He was, as was pretty much every man in that era, especially veterans, rarely talked about it, especially with us kids. As we got older, he'd mention a few things here and there, but it frustrated me a little bit because I like history, and even then I wanted to learn a little bit more about it firsthand. But later I got to understand that he wasn't the only one of that era soldiers. As a matter of fact, I found paperwork in his effects once that had these booklets encouraging people, the soldiers when they return to the U.S. don't talk about it. So based on that, and then their lack of desire to anyway, leave it there, let's get on with our lives here.
Is that how they handled PSD? Maybe, you know?
Probably, yeah. He was, one of the lucky ones as far as that. Most of them were, but there was some. You look back and you probably figure, if you want to spend the time researching, there's probably a lot of young men of that era that after the war, 40s, 50s, had issues and could be traced to that, certainly.
Yeah. And so...
so after the war, he came back and he returned full-time to the Sanford Tribune and worked there until 52 when a friend of his from Sanford, actually, who became publisher of the Telegraph, had some openings as a result of a walkout by some disgruntled reporters. So he had thought of my father. He says, hey, you want to come to Nashua, work at the Telegraph? It's a daily. We could use you. He said, sure. So I landed in Nashua.
Good for him. Now, was he a journalist as well, or just a photographer? Or
Both. Yeah. He, like I say, he did sports writing. That was his chief beat, but he also did some news. He had a column called Mike's Musings, which he'd opine of the issues of the day and what have you.
Like an editorial? Or...
Yeah. Like a pretty standard column. You get things in there that weren't really news stories or something behind the scenes or whatever. So he did that all the while conjuring up these ideas, sometimes for trick photography, for scenic photography. I always liked scenic stuff, and for people. He'd get an idea and he'd execute it with the camera, and then in the dark room, very clever way of doing things, certainly.
Did you go in the dark room much when you were a kid?
Yes, I did. Matter of fact, when I started the Telegraph for the first several years, or probably 10 years, we did in fact still have dark rooms with the open trays of chemicals.
My dad on Concord Street, he had a little printing business, 7 Concord Street. Now it's the open door thing.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, down in the basement was his printing shop, and he had his own little dark room, and he had those open trays, and it smelled good. It was just a funky smell, and he had the red light and all that. It was,
yeah.
But I was always fascinated with that. Now he'd put the film in it, and he'd put it into one thing and another solution, and all of a sudden it'd appear.
Yeah, you'd have to roll the film and something and develop it with that, and then develop the prints from the negatives, and sometimes real quickly if it's coming up on deadline and you just covered something. So it still amazed me to think back that I used to do it that way and how we got newspapers out on a daily basis.
Right.
When today it's a few clicks of the mouse and so forth, and still we have trouble sometimes meeting deadline. So
that is interesting because it is quite the process. First you have to go to the site, get the film, develop it, and then blow it up, and then transpose it onto some type of a sheet, which then would go onto the printing press, which would then generate the...
Precise.
Because they would actually have to burn it into a plate.
That's correct, yeah.
Because he was a printer. So.
All that process in large scale every day at the Telegraph and every other newspaper.
So you're watching this as you're growing up. I mean, you must have been fascinated with what he was doing.
Very much so. It availed me to a lot of different events, scenes, places that I wouldn't have been able to go to, certainly, would have no reason to go to if not accompanying him. I still laugh with some of the friends of mine in the neighborhood. hear the horn, we used to call the boudang, the fire horn that would summon off-duty personnel whenever there was a fire. It would number the sound it made would determine what box was coming in, what fire alarm box, if they went to a general alarm. So if he heard that, he'd look it up, and we'd pile in the car and he'd take us. Not always, but sometimes. School nights were tough, you
Right.
know. But during the summer, he'd tell you, here, you know, give me something to carry and just stay by me and don't do anything. And you know, and I think my interest in spot news and photography and newspapering in general was certainly born of that. You know, I was interested in that respect, and then you could say I chased sirens naturally from then and today. You know, you hear more sirens today, but I still listen to them and try to make a determination if it's something worth covering. So those were fun times. I remember some were tragedies to the point, like a serious auto accident. He'd banish us to the car and say, you can't come out on this one.
Yeah.
And which made you want to come out more, but you obeyed and so forth. And sometimes it troubled him, but a lot of times, most of the time, you know, he covered the news. He wrote a story if there had to be a story, and you know, it would be in the next day's paper.
Did it always seem like he was working?
He had set hours. He'd go in. They went in fairly early because it was an afternoon paper, meaning the press started around 12:30 or so, 1 o'clock p.m., kind of the opposite as it is now. It's a.m. instead of p.m. But he'd go in early, 7:30. He'd be home by 4:30 or so. And no, he was off then, and it was rare unless there was some breaking news that somebody would call him to chase, but that wasn't that often.
What were some of the big events that he covered that you thought were?
Well, I know he covered President Kennedy's visit to Nashua before he was president. Actually, when he announced in Nashua on January of, it was 60, I guess, January of 1960, when he announced his candidacy in City Hall, and my father was there, and I might have been too, but I don't know for sure. People have asked me. So I trot those photos out once in a while, and he went inside City Hall when Kennedy toured it, and he took some photos of various City Hall employees with Kennedy, and Mrs. Kennedy was actually there, and he went to some of the stores on Main Street, restaurants, Kennedy did, and my father followed him there, of course.
Did you keep those pictures?
Most of them, yeah. I have a lot. The Historical Society, he donated to a lot to the Historical Society, hence this exhibit.
And now there is an exhibit here at the National Library.
Correct, yeah. This is the third that the Historical Society's done. This one has about 70 or so of his photos in it. There's a whole bunch that he donated. They have a lot more negatives that have yet to be printed. But there were extras, duplicates, and there were others that, you know, had no real bearing on historical Nashua that I still have, along with his equipment and everything like that. Tons of family photos and, you know, things like that. But between us, you know, we between myself and the Historical Society, we have a pretty good collection. Yeah.
What was the type of camera that he used? Obviously, we've seen the evolution of change, you know, just from the Polaroids to the big flash bulbs. What did he start off with?
Well, a big flash bulb, and it was a single shot deal. And if you forgot to replace the used flash bulb, you'd waste a piece of film, which isn't like missing a photo, even with 35 millimeter film. You just go on to the next one. Certainly not with a digital camera. But his main camera was a Speed Graphic, it was called, also alternately called Speed Graflex, F-L-E-X. It's a 4x5 format, meaning 4 by 5 inches is the size of the negative, and it makes crystal clear prints because you're only doubling the size of the negative. Whereas to make an 8 by 10 picture is a 35 millimeter, you're enlarging it multiple times. But with that comes a lot of inconvenience. And to think that to have a moving event going on before you, and he had to take these, what they called dark slides, where there were 2 pieces of film, one on either side. You'd put it in, pull the slide, take your picture, put it back in, flip it over. Then you'd have to remember, did I flip it yet? Or then you double expose. So he'd fill his case, big case, with a bunch of those.
And you had to cart that off wherever you're going.
And every day or so you'd have to go in and load film. You'd have to put new film in each of those carriers. To me, it's an almost impossible task to do any quality work that way. But they did, not only him, but a lot of photographers
Thousands
did.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the thing was heavy, it was unwieldy, but it was his chief piece of equipment, and it served him well.
Interesting. And yeah, I'm just thinking about the mechanics of all that. You know, I bought myself a new camera. It's a D71 something or other Nikon, and the thing just automatically focuses. I can catch kids running when they're playing lacrosse, you know, and it just easy. Click, 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 click. But when you look back to the old days, I do remember the little bulbs that you had to replace. And if they went off, you know, that's it. You know, then they got a little bit more modern. Then they had the band of them where they go.
The strips.
The strips.
And the cubes. Remember the flash cubes? You'd stick in a flash, turn once, and turn 3 times, and all 4 sides were. I still got some of the like Instamatics, they call them, I think. There's probably still some kicking around the house, just, you know, that don't work, but, you know, they're fun to look at once in a while. But that was the evolution. Polaroid was a big deal, although that wasn't really used professionally much. It was, they stuck by their, you know, time-proven hardware. The 4x5s, they got into a 2 1/4 square format, which were called single lens reflex cameras. Before we got into 35 cameras,
I can't believe I know. I was around then too. You know.
Yeah. The Yashica was a common brand. Yashica Mat, Yashica D. You look down through it, and twin lens reflex. So one lens was the viewfinder, and the other shot the photo.
Just the opposite of what a periscope is, basically.
Precisely, yeah. And you move this way, the image goes that way, so it's a mirror of itself. Those, to me, weren't that much more convenient than the 4x5s, but we'd strap on a great big flash and...
Speaking of the ambulances or the sirens or whatever, was he around for was it the Crown Hill fire? Was there...
1930.
Oh, that's a little bit before his time then.
He was 11 years old, but he didn't live in Nashua.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I've talked to, in previous years, people who were kids or young adults at that time. And
I didn't know when that dated. So
yeah, it was May 4, 1930. It's quite a piece of Nashua's history, that's for sure.
Yeah. Years ago, there was a fire. It was actually Shagnan's Lumber, and that was right behind my house.
Yeah, I covered that.
Yeah.
Shagnan's, yeah. I covered Nashua Lumbers too, but Shagnan's, I believe, was on a Saturday. Shagnan Lumber.
Was it on a Saturday? I know I had to go to school the next day, so. And
maybe it was a Sunday, but I wasn't even working, but I saw the smoke and turned on my scanner, and sure enough. So that was
a big deal.
Yeah, it was.
It was kind of scary. I used to play in that yard, you know, quite a bit.
And if the wind, there was some breeze, I remember them saying at the time, but if it had been stronger and blowing in a certain direction, they were scared to death that they'd have a mini Crown Hill.
That's right.
You know, they had better equipment then, certainly, and more manpower, but still.
Well, a lot of changes happened. You know, I remember fishing down at in the Nashua River and Merrimack River, where there was actually raw sewage going in through this, you know, and people actually still swam in the river at that time. Did he have photos of the river and the conditions of things like that, or of a lot of changes structurally in our city?
He did. He documented such things for stories. It was tough in the black and white era to really show a lot of difference or a lot of pollution. But I remember my first few years at the Telegraph, when it was on Main Street, we had no air conditioning in the newsroom. So in the summer, we'd open the windows big and wide, and it overlooked, that wing overlooked the Nashua River.
Right.
Kind of, we'd look across to what's Peddler's Daughter today.
Yep.
And depending on what job Nashua Corp was doing, the river would have a tint of green, perhaps red, perhaps brown, depending on what job they were working on. And you could tell when Isadore, the hairstylist, was doing a lot of shampoos, because sure enough, suds would come out of this little inlet. So
It's kind of frightening now.
it
to
is.
Think about it,
It
right?
really is, to think of the ability for people to do that and nobody to be horrified by it.
Well, what's interesting, just down the road, there was the footbridge.
Yes.
And we used to go down the footbridge and we'd go fishing. And we'd get the carp. And I wouldn't eat the carp, but there were families that did. And there were, that was
Because
you want this?
they
This
wanna-
is good
yeah.
stuff, And I'm thinking, no, okay, sure. But I just love to fish, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
And I
Well, a
did-
lot of people did that, but to actually eat them was another thing.
I know, but thinking about all that pollution and how that a lot of now you can go canoeing down the river and it's just beautiful.
It really is. Anytime you hear, repeal of EPA regulations, you start thinking back to how horrible that was. And if there was nothing done at the time, 30, 40, 50 years ago, what would it look like today?
Oh.
You shudder to think.
Well, it might look like that Orange River that's flowing today.
Yeah, geez.
And the EPA is the one
Oddly
who did it.
caused by the EPA because they had a misstep or something out there. But it can be said there's some regulations maybe overburdening in some cases, but the basic tenets of it, oh my goodness.
I think most everybody wants clean water now, and
Yeah.
especially when you see the changes. And it's nice to see that people are actually canoeing up and down the river and enjoying. I know the water's still, things are still being put into the water to some degree. You have some of these, these plants where they recondition the water, but
Right.
I wouldn't
that's
drink it,
true. Right. Yeah. As far as going into it, when I was a kid, we lived on the east side, not far from the river, which the bordered. It was the Merrimack, which bordered Nashua and Hudson, of course. And it was, a couple hundred yards from the house, so our parents said stay away from it. Not because we couldn't swim, we could, but because it was so filthy they didn't want us near it.
Oh, you could see the raw sewage going in.
Yeah.
And I remember that. So you have a lot of photographs of different time periods and different events going on. Obviously, John Kennedy was an interesting fact. Are you noticing a lot of changes with Main Street or with the view of Nashua through some of his?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of different, certainly just about every storefront has changed. I guess you could safely say everyone has changed. Configuration of streets, one-ways, not one-ways, and so forth. Different ways of parking, diagonal versus angled. And, well, diagonal and angled kind of one and the same, but parallel. There was recent talk at City Hall past couple of years of trying to go back maybe to that diagonal parking, and maybe it would create more parking, but then you'd lose a lane either way of the street, or at least most of it. So it's a toss-up, I think, what you do. There were far fewer cars, obviously, in Nashua at the time. Just period, there were far fewer cars, but he also documented the opening of the Everett Turnpike. Its first incarnation was the Nashua Bypass, which looked about like Henry Burke Highway does now.
Yeah.
And it actually had a stoplight
Did
at
it really?
West Hollis.
Wow.
It wasn't an overpass. And I got an aerial photo of that, and there's so few cars on it, it's laughable. But yeah, I think the first bridges it was Broad Street and maybe Amherst Street, and then it ended. It just went it continued as Henry Burke Highway. And then the next incarnation, the next leg, they connected it with 293 in Manchester, built it, and then they went south of East Dunstable, because it would end there. And then at the Daniel Webster Highway, that's why to this day, going south, you still have that oddball left-hand exit. So that was the end of it. Then they, in like the early 60s, I think they built the section of the turnpike that would connect with Massachusetts.
Now, how long has the exhibit been at the library?
It went up in the early part of July, and we had an opening reception, which was very well attended on the 22nd of July. And it is up at the National Public Library in the Image Gallery through the end of August. During regular library hours, anybody can just go down. It's on the lower level, ask for directions, and it's there, and there's a guest book to sign. There's some information, a few placards describing my father and everything, and the rest are all his photos that range from sports to personalities, to school things, to all kinds of spot news things. Very good cross section, I think.
Oh, I'm gonna have to make a point to go see it.
Yes.
This is very. I love history too.
Yeah, I encourage anybody to, even if you're not a native Nashuan, but especially older people who lived through that period somewhere else. It's not that much different. It's just Nashua. Most of America looked roughly the same, so you get a good idea of Nashua's history through that.
And you're actually part of it, and so is he, obviously. He must have been proud of you, obviously. What a legacy that he left following in his footsteps.
I think he was grateful. I think he was pleased that I followed in this business. He probably knew, the only regret he might have had is that he knew going forward, if I stayed in this business, I wouldn't ever become wealthy. But neither did he, and
But you're
it didn't bother him. You know, you get enough, you make enough to keep the sheriff out of the yard, as they say, and you know, we certainly don't do it to get rich. This business in general, we do it to inform. We do it to bring not only news but feature stuff to people and entertain and inform them. And that's anytime we're able to do that, it's well worth it.
I appreciate you coming on the show to talk about it.
It's my pleasure. I enjoy very much both history and reminiscing, so the combination.
Wonderful. Well, we hope you folks, if you're interested in looking at some of the history and some of the photos, stop by the Nashua Library and check it out. Until next week, thanks for watching Gate City Chronicles. And if you have a story, be sure to contact us, and we'd love to talk to you about it. All right. Until next week. Thank you for watching Gate City Chronicles, and we want to thank our sponsor, Avard Cleaning. They've been a sponsor for quite a few years now, and we appreciate them being a sponsor. And if you want to be a guest on our show, contact accessnashua@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your story. Until next week, thanks for watching.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.